to begin.
Hey everybody, welcome to the CISO series video chat. My name is David Spark. I am your host for the very video chat. The producer who's in the background, that is Andrew. He's going to be running on everything. Let me give you all up to date on what's going on today. Today's topic is hacking systemic risk, an hour of critical thinking around the inherent risk in running a digital business. So let me make something clear. We're not going to be focusing on cyber risk. And we'll talk about this right up front, but let me get through the mechanics right now. And the first is our guest, Mike Wilkes, CISO of Security Scorecard. You've seen Mike before here. He's popped on a bunch of times before. Plus, he was one of our guests before. And we also have Krista Arndt, who's, by the way, been a long-time attendee and has joined many of our video chats, but now is on camera for us. She is the Deputy CISO over at Customers Bank. I want to thank Security Scorecard for sponsoring this very episode. Thank you very much, Security Scorecard. I appreciate that. And also, for those of you who have never been here before, if it is your first time ever to one of our video chats, let me explain a few things. All the old hats, you can take a snooze right now. 5 different ways to participate. You can participate in the chat room. You'll see it's very active. They get a lot of inside jokes. If you don't get them, ask somebody to explain it or not. Submit some bad ideas. Okay, a lot of you are here because Dutch posted a photo of him wearing this very fleece and taunting you that the only way you're going to get it is if you come up with a really bad idea, or essentially the winning bad idea. So winners do get a very awesome sweatshirt. I'm actually changing suppliers right now, so I don't know exactly what it's going to look, but we're going for a nice fleece, so you'll get something nice and cool. You can join us on video. If you just type "bring me on," if you got a question or a comment, go ahead and do that. Ask a question at any time. We're going to try to get to as many as yours as possible. Also, to help us decide which question to ask, go ahead and vote for your favorite question as well. Our schedule, questions, we'll start off with that. Submit your bad ideas. We're going to actually discuss what sort of the topic of systemic versus cognitive risk right at the beginning. We're going to put up the poll 20 minutes after the hour. That'll be the poll for all the bad ideas. You vote for your favorite bad ideas. Then we'll play Beat the Bad Idea. I should mention, I want you to get your bad ideas in.
Send them in. We need your bad ideas.
Also, vote for your favorite questions. Also, 45 minutes past the hour, we'll bring in Matthew Bibby, who was last week's winner of the Best Bad Idea. He will come on and challenge our 2 guests for their favorite bad ideas. Remember, Matthew, get those 2 into our producer by 30 minutes past the hour. And at 50 minutes, we'll have our last question, final advice. And at the very end, at the end of the hour, we go into our icebreaker. And if you've never done this before, it's a lot of fun. You know all that serendipity you used to enjoy when you went to trade shows and conferences? Well, you get to kind of enjoy that a little bit here, where you get like one-on-one meetings with another cyber professional. So we will make that link available at the end of the show. But right now, the link at the bottom of the screen, that is for next Friday's video chat, which is hacking board metrics. That's going to be an interesting topic as well. You can click on that link at any time during this hour. Just note that it is not going to take you out of this. It will not refresh the screen. It'll open up another tab. You can register for that while this is happening. All right. Enough of that bantering back and forth. Krista, Mike, thank you for being very patient as I got through all that information. I'm going to start with you, Mike, on this very opening question, and that is, please define what systemic risk is and how that differs from cognitive risk, explaining what cognitive risk is as well.
Well, thank you, David. And let me first recognize that this is a quasi-anniversary for me. It was 1 year ago on March 3rd where we gathered face-to-face.
Yes.
And recorded the CISO
our live show in New York.
Yes. No video, though. It was audio only back then.
We had a photographer, so there's photo evidence that you were there.
True, but no frames per second. So anyway, great to see you doing well and great to be back on the show. And the reason I like this topic is because I feel that we're paying a lot of attention to risks that we can wrap our heads around and that we can measure, quantify, and try to mitigate with tools. And I think there's an area of the risk surface, that's not being addressed. And I use the term systemic risk. CISO recently published a blog post about a systemic risk venture as well. And in that blog post, they actually mentioned cybersecurity ratings for the very first time. And so I thought that was really a good hook to try to play on for this discussion. For me, systemic risk is about the assumptions that are built into the system. It's not necessarily about being a technologist, but it's about the attitudes and some of the complex aspects of the system that lend to it becoming fragile, brittle, or insecure. Think, for example, the near meltdown of the Texas grid, right? And how there was a bunch of plants that couldn't generate electricity or because they were relying on gas, but the gas was fed by electric compressors, which had been shut down by some of the rolling blackouts. And they didn't know that. So they took off, they shed load to try to solve that problem. And it had this kind of cascade effect. So I think systemic risk is partially filled with this idea of cognitive risk, our beliefs, our intentions in the attackers and in the defenders that we really need to think about and explode some of those assumptions, make them more explicit, and then try to actually engineer against them. And so we can leave cyber risk a little bit off the table today and just talk about risk in general. I thought that would make for a fun conversation.
Yes, and I think it is very interesting. So, Krista, you work at Customers Bank. Is this a question you asked yourself? And I'm assuming it's not just for the cyber department, but you ask yourself and the business and it's sort of an ongoing place, like, what are the risks we're really taking on? And are there any risks that we're taking on that we assume we should be taking on that we shouldn't? Is this a discussion that you guys have?
Yeah, we have it a lot. So as you know, financial institutions are heavily risk averse, but at the same time, it's a balancing act between trying to understand you have to accept a certain amount of risk as a business to survive, right? It's just the nature of any business. And where we kind of come into play is, I'm going to say that we use a lot of suppliers, right? So the financial industry, especially with the digital transformation, unless you're a really large industry, you're going to use a lot of suppliers. And the traditional view that you can transfer risks to your suppliers, I don't think that specifically stands within security. So getting to kind of right size the understanding and being a security champion and making sure they understand, when it comes to security risk, it's a little bit different. I think we wrestle with that a lot.
Okay, well, understood. And I would assume that this varies widely depending on where you stand. And actually, I mean, at your business, Mike, you are, I'm assuming, dealing with clients who are extremely risk averse, like a bank, like with Chris is, and others who are not as risk averse. Are you having these kind of conversations with them? Because, I mean, what you're doing with your business is you're sort of scoring risk, talking about risk. How do they sort of adopt systemic and cognitive risk depending on how their risk level sort of cranks up, if you will?
Well, I think there's a really simple answer, and then the more complicated answer that I'll spend a little more time on. The simple answer is you just throw a bunch of your vendors into a folder, and boom, out comes the average risk for that set of vendors, right? Because it's just a number, it's a score, but it's a very accurate reflection of what we can tell from the outside in with our signals intelligence, looking at headers, scanning the internet every month, and looking at DNS records and things like that. So let's say that you take the Department of Energy, and then you take all of the national labs. You put them all in a folder, call it a portfolio, and suddenly you get a good benchmark. Which of the labs are above or below average? And that way you can kind of focus on some of your risk. You could do it in the oil and gas industry as well. You could take your upstream suppliers, your downstream suppliers, and you can calculate aggregate and average risk. And of course, know what some of those aspects are and work with them if you feel that they would impact you as a supply chain provider. But the more complicated question is, what kind of a dialogue are we having about systemic risk? And certainly it was elevated to even my parents kind of radar with SolarWinds, right? And everyone talking about it. And Tom Brokaw was
I'm interested to know, how did your parents approach sort of hearing about SolarWinds to you? Like, how did that sort of come out of their mouth to you?
They said, "Oh God, Michael, is it that bad?" And I said, "Yes, it's far worse, actually." Critical infrastructure is held together with duct tape and baling wire, and Texas was an unforced error. If the Russians had been going after the Texas grid and wanted to knock it out, it would have been Stone Ages for Texas for a few months.
Mm-hmm. Well, good, very good point. All right, questions. By the way, you can get your questions, and usually by this time I already got a bunch of questions, but from the audience. But don't worry, I got plenty of questions of my own. Let's boil this down because you gave some good examples of systemic and cognitive risk. Actually, Krista, can you give some examples you believe are good examples of systemic and cognitive risk so people can sort of wrap their heads around this a little bit?
Sure. So I like to talk about this stuff and relate it to racing, right? So it's funny
Who,
in
by the
being
way,
in
let me mention to everyone, Krista is a drag racer. And let me also make clear that she does not race for NASCAR. She's a drag. There are many racing leagues out there. NASCAR is not the only one. They just happen to have a lot of coverage, and they don't do drag racing. Go ahead, Krista.
Yeah, I was going to say yee. There were actually discussion on LinkedIn today about security companies getting into the sponsorship of Formula One. So yeah, you guys probably know about that too.
And well, NTT Data, I know, sponsors IndyCar, and I actually used to do some work for IndyCar myself. And yeah, I've seen plenty of security companies on race cars before. So nice. I don't know about Formula One, though. I don't know if I've seen.
So so let's relate this to drag racing, right? I don't turn left, I don't turn right, I go straight. So I'm going to point straight on this one. I like to think of systemic risk beyond the internal systemic risk of how risk flows through the various layers of organizational management. I like to imagine risk industry-wide, and kind of in my mind, I liken it to our tiny planet floating around in a vast expanse of outer space. And I'd love to have time to analyze how one organization's actions affect another. And we see elements of this train of thought when it comes to offensive threat intelligence as a protective measure, but we're so caught up in managing our own teams and business strategies, we rarely give much thought to looking at a bigger picture of how does our risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity affect our industry peers. So that's how I like to think of systemic risk. And I probably could get into, team building in racing, right? Because you and your team are really important. You work together as kind of a bunch of cogs on the wheel. And cyber is a team effort, but in risk, we often act like the kid in team sports whose mantra is there's no I in team, that there's a me. And we know from racing that it takes, everybody from the crew chief to the person working on rebuilding the motors between rounds if you run, a NHRA, that type of stuff to really make the risk wheel go around.
Mm-hmm. So, good point, and thank you for explaining. Mike, you jumping in?
Yeah, you mentioned risk appetite, and I think that's an important piece for us to discuss, because there's also the aspect of it of what risk should a business be taking, because sometimes the risk is to not take a risk, if you get what I mean. And so there's certain risks, because security is not in the business of getting rid of risk, it's just mitigating it to a point that the business can afford, right? If we can put lots of multi-factor auth around our apps and keep the crown jewels protected, that's going to cost a certain amount of money. And eventually you have this idea of a residual risk, and that's something that the business can sign off on. But this idea of making sure that we identify what is our risk appetite, what's our risk tolerance. And if we don't put everything on the table, then there's a bunch of risk that we're leaving around, waiting basically to rear its ugly head, and scare the bejesus out of us. Right? Like, the Russians hacking supply chain into SolarWinds and getting into the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, and umpteen thousand companies. And so I think that the idea of discussion of risk ought to include what risks should we be taking? Where should we be disrupting our own assumptions and business processes, top down in the org chart from the board of directors on down, because it's already happening bottom up. There's plenty of clever monkeys out there disrupting the business and saying, hey, I got a new way of wiring this together. It'll be more resilient, more fault tolerant, and there'll be less moving pieces. And so they keep it simple, stupid process, gets applied. And so I'd like to figure out how we can sort of hack risk from the top of the org chart, because bottom up, you have great things like chaos engineering, Chaos Monkey, Simian Army. These are cool ways of experimenting with complex systems and trying to figure out how they break, and make sure they break in a degraded, way rather than just wink out of existence.
I have a question that refers to top down, and I like this. And I'd be interested to know if this sort of philosophy is starting to fade away, this too big to fail philosophy. I mean, for so long, there have been companies like, well, we're IBM, we're this company, we can't fail. And yet we've seen huge companies being brought down to their knees or essentially evaporate because they had that feeling that they felt that they couldn't fail, or that they had this systemic risk that they had to hold on to specifically, or it was actually cognitive, as you explained. So this question comes from Craig Herter. When dealing with systemic risk, how does one appropriately get buy-in for your too big to fail components, and in turn the remediation? So let me just ask, Kristen, you don't work at a company that's too big to fail, but how to what level do both of you feel that there are people outside of cyber that still think they work at a company that's too big to fail? Or does everyone feel that they're at a certain level of risk that they could be essentially consumed by either a hack, or just by not paying attention to their business and someone coming on and sort of not attacking them, but overcoming their business? Either of you jump in on this.
Yeah, I can add a little context on this. So I think that a lot of people have that misconception because they don't understand how risk functions throughout the architecture of an organization, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to really understand the why behind, why you're managing risk and what the risks are and how risk management works at every level, I think, to actively understand, that no one is averse to failure. It's like the guy that, comes out in a brand new car and has a lucky streak and wins, and, his head explodes and he gets a really big ego, and instantly, a systemic issue on the car, causes something to fail, right? So cognitively, he's like, oh yeah, this is great. So this comes to cognitive risk, right? So organizations or people think that regardless of what size their organization is, they can't fail. That's an example of cognitive risk, just like it's an example of cognitive risk when it comes to racing. And the systemic risk is in unaccounted for failure of a part of your race car, and then instantly everything implodes. Like it could be a critical part and you don't understand the criticality of everything. So I think that's where I come from.
But let me ask this. I heard, and I think it was on an episode of Radiolab that I heard this, and it had to do with that people who were the best liars were people who were like top tier athletes, because they were good at convincing themselves that they were so good, and that not only had they trained to be really, really good, but they had done that. And I got to assume, to be a race car driver, to be any kind of athlete, you have to have a certain level of the ego of, you are better. And so, yes, there is risk, but you have to sort of overcome it at a certain level. And I would assume that certain businesses can operate like that too. I mean, this is just a philosophy of sort of the ego has some value to overcoming risk. I think that's my way of putting it. Do you think that as well? I mean, for sports and for business? I'll start with you, Chris, and then Mike.
Yeah, I think that this is probably the wrong word to use, but I think that you have to come back to humility and the understanding of where you lie in the scheme of things. You can outwardly project ego and confidence and inwardly still understand the impact that something could have. So I think that a lot of that is false, but also that you have been programmed, or you've programmed yourself cognitively to disregard fear. And I think, that could potentially feed into it, that they program themselves cognitively to disregard risk as, one of those kind of transitions into taking aboard more risk, right? Thinking that, if it happens, it's going to happen, and that's okay.
What do you think about this idea of sort of the top performers having this ego, and when that ego is so strong and they are able to sort of convince themselves that either they don't have risk or they can't fail, that is a way to sort of overcome risk in itself, if you will? I mean, what do you think, Mike?
I don't know. It sounds a little bit like you're trying to talk to a tightrope walker and say, don't look down. And that's how they get across. But I don't think they get across by not looking down. I think they're aware of the ground and the terminal velocity they will reach when they go splat. But if you want to find good examples in business, Blockbuster, Kodak, they failed to disrupt. They were completely in charge of their game, and they didn't want to get rid of what they thought was a profit center, aka film, for digital photography. And they could have transitioned. They could have adapted, and they could have survived. If you look at like the Harvard case studies. These are epic fails. And so I think that believing that you're the best is a certain bravado that is found, certainly.
But we see that. But no, I'm sorry. We see this in Silicon Valley with the the upstart companies now that have this hyper growth, and they have this attitude of we can't fail because look.
Yeah, if you want to climb the hype curve and reach and be king of the mountain on the hype curve, then you definitely have to lie, and you definitely have to have a super inflated sense of self and purpose, because otherwise you don't get the venture capital money. Maybe the systemic risk there is that we're only going for tall blades of grass, and really, to reduce systemic risk, we have to raise the bar, from the bottom rather than the top.
All right. We have Bryn, I believe, is coming on right now. She'll have a question or comment. Hopefully she'll jump on. Let me remind people as we're waiting for Bryn. The poll is now up. So please vote on your favorite bad idea if you haven't done that already. And if you haven't registered for next week's video chat, go ahead and click on the link. Bryn, you have a question, a comment. What is it?
Yeah, so I had a comment. So as a pretty much lifelong athlete and previous studier of behavioral science and sports psychology, I think that the ego piece is kind of, it's in a way a catch-22, because nobody generally gets ego from just thinking that they have it. Usually there's some history there. So athletes have trained hundreds of thousands of hours, especially the top athletes, Olympians, and other people of that caliber have literally trained for those competitions their entire lives. So they kind of do have to have that level of, I wouldn't call it ego, I'd call it confidence, because it's something that they've practiced for forever. It's something that they have done before, and it's something that they have practiced getting in the mindset to, because the more you train, the more adrenaline kicks in when you're actually in the moment. And the adrenaline basically forces you to either pick whether you're going to sink or swim. And if you've practiced enough, you're going to swim. So there's that confidence and that level of competence that you get just from practicing that I think is separate from just having an ego that I can do this because I think I can.
But let me go back to that, and I'm going to throw this both to you, Krista, and Mike, and stay right there, Bryn, is maybe it's the training that the way that one wins is you don't think you can fail. I got to assume that I mean, you look at Olympic athletes, I mean, they think at that level, which most of us don't think that way. I think we all think we can fail, but when you get to that elite level, you don't feel you can. So let me ask, in a cybersecurity department, could a team train itself so darn well that we can't fail? I mean, have that mindset, and does that mindset have value, or it's like, that doesn't mean squat here. I mean, we're hacking this concept of systemic risk. I'm throwing this out as an idea. Krista, you want to answer this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've seen historically that, no one really gets ahead and stays ahead long term who hasn't failed severely in the past. I'll give you an example. So in 2015, I had a really bad race car accident. The car, essentially the brakes failed. The car went into the retaining net at the end of Atlanta Dragway. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I analyzed and overanalyzed everything from the human factor, or the cognitive risk, or the cognitive response, your unconscious and conscious response, to if it was the car's fault, was it something I did that caused that. So I think that it can be detrimental to a team to get to the point where you're saying, even though it's a hyped up mindset and saying, it's a positive mindset, we can't fail. You're never going to continue to learn and grow and transform with cyber, with any industry, if you don't have failures and setbacks here and there, because those are opportunities to learn. And like I said, I learned so much from that it was probably more valuable than learning in a book or getting a certification, or certifying your organization to ISO 9001 or CMMI or CMMC or whatever you want to do.
Let me take this to you, Mike. And by the way, I got one more question after this. Bryn, by the way, I think it's great because Brian Solari also has a great question. By the way, he's thanking you for the Brian, since his name is so similar to yours, just an extra vowel. Mike, go ahead. Your take on this sort of theory of extreme confidence.
What was I going to say? I actually want to refer to CrowdStrike and FireEye, for example. Look at what FireEye did when they got hacked, right? They shot the hostage. They said, hey, the bad guys took our red team tools. here's how our red team tools work. Go and program all your tools to stop it from. Basically, they're robbing that theft of any value. And I think that kind of transparency is important. And I think there's a lot of situations where people think they're at the top of their game, and maybe they are at the top of their game. But they can still get knocked down, and they can still have that moment. So, what I like, Krista, what you mentioned. What did you ever see the short film series that Honda did about their racing team called Dreams? Because they talked about pushing the envelope and failing and having an engine explode on the racetrack, and they told a story about someone rushing out there to pick up all the pieces, right? And say, well, why are you doing this? Asked one of the managers. And it's like, well, they might figure out our tech. And I was like, the engine just blew up. Why would they want our tech? And so that caused big change in the approach to the racing team, and then they started winning. Anyway,
that's
it's a very
good
powerful
point. The fear of what someone else may know. And to quote a friend of mine, Bill, who used to say, the only way someone's going to steal your idea is if you ram it down your throat. Their throat, excuse me. They just don't steal it. Bryn, are you satisfied by these answers?
Yeah. The only thing I wanted to add was that I think you're on the right track with fear too. I don't think, and this is going to be a slightly different intonation, so sorry if this is confusing. I don't think it's the idea that we can't fail in that we're not capable of failing, but we can't fail in that it's that level of fear. Like, we shouldn't fail because we would rather beat them. Not that we're not capable of it, but it's the idea that, if we fail, we're letting ourselves down, we're letting, in this case, like the company down, we're letting our employees down. So I think it's that fear of failing rather than that ego that it's not possible.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
True.
Very good point. All right.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I got a really good question that came in from Brian that I want to ask, and we're going to ask this, and we'll go to our next game. Brian Solari asked, and this is really kind of a basic question, and I'm interested from you, Mike, how much view do you get into this with either past work or your clients right now? How do you weigh the risk versus revenue when there is a substantial opportunity to add revenue, but there is also a big risk you have to take to capitalize on that opportunity? So, for example, add a second cloud provider or change a critical business process. When you're showing them risk, how much visibility do you get into that decision-making of the risk reward? And can you sort of, if you have seen it either currently or in past work, how does that play itself out?
Well, I think it depends what industry you're in, because if you have an external regulator, it's so easy to just calculate the fines, right? And to calculate, the potential loss of business, and then your board of directors, and people controlling the budget will listen. I think it's harder for companies that aren't regulated because they don't have those teeth, those external teeth. They have to find intrinsic motivations for people to do the right thing and say, well, we want to keep the business going in case a hurricane takes out US East. Or some other type of regional disaster. What is the likelihood of that happening, right? Risk has to be at its basic level, impact times, likelihood. And so if people believe that these sparse events, these infrequent events are going to ruin things, it's important for us to put it in language that matches the business model.
Okay. We have Dutch wearing a very, very nice sweatshirt, I should mention, and also a new baseball cap. Also, Matthew Bibby, make sure that you get your two best bad ideas for the what's worse scenario in within the next couple of minutes. All right. Dutch, what you got for us?
Yeah, my question is, Bryn's right as she exited said the most interesting thing, at least to me, and that's, let's talk about failure. What is the mental framework? Because if the framework is, we talked about fear of failure right as she was exiting, right? If you think that the goal is to not fail, I actually think that that's a bad framing, right? So look at a black swan event, right? Professor Taleb says that's the definition. You cannot expect it. That is what a black swan event is.
We're living in a black swan event right now.
Yes, stop spending cycles gnashing our teeth, and we can do multiplicative math forever about what we think might and might not. It doesn't matter because it's not a useful framing for people and process. So what you should be doing is saying, we anticipate that there's going to be an unexpected risk. How do we respond to that? That's resiliency to me. So that's my framing, but I'm curious, Mike, Krista, how do you frame it?
Yeah, and I'm going to say, and this resounds throughout our entire organization, while you try to manage risk proactively as much as you can, you have to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And actually in cyber, what's going to get you ahead is to have a really sound response plan. So it's going to be the time to containment and how quickly and with the velocity and veracity that you can respond to an incident, because it's only a matter of time for everybody. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but it's reality.
Mm-hmm.
Mike,
No, I think that you're right. I think the resilience and focus on resilience is way more important than failure avoidance, because you will fail. Systems do fail, and for whatever reason, whether they're just so old and someone came at it with a new attack, right? So I think that a holistic definition of resilience ought to be more than just the engineering definition of the word. For me, being a philosopher, I love to unpack how we define our words. And so if we think about resilience as being like ductile strength and tensile strength of metal, and does the metal go back to its regular shape after it's been deformed, that's not the same as we use it in psychology or ecology, right? Sustainability and resilience of the ecosystem, you don't go back to the person you were before, right? And you adapt, you have to transform. It's our ability to respond quickly. And like Krista said, have a good response plan, own that narrative. Don't let the internet write it for you, right? Have something published and ready to go ahead of time that says, yes, this event happened, and here's what we're doing to fix it. And of course, everyone has to do identity theft monitoring for a breach, and send out that stuff. But really, the real failure, I think, is in your inability to respond and to recover and to move through the last two phases, of incident response with confidence, and know that we're going to mitigate that risk. It's not going to happen again. And rather than fear of avoidance of failure is not a tenable worldview in my mind.
All right, we have to go to our next question.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dutch. Thank you for wearing the correct sharp sweatshirt. Here we go.
It's time to play Beat the Bad Idea.
All right, here we go. For those of you who don't know, we had switched from the Department of Yes to Beat the Bad Idea because I think this is an easier, maybe not easier, but it's just sort of, people are wrapping their heads around this game a little bit better. All right, so we have a lot of bad ideas that have come in. A lot of people want to win this sweatshirt, and this one got voted up a lot. And as someone who actually has done improv, was a comedy writer for Second City back in the day, I appreciate this bad idea that's come in. Remember, your goal, Krista and Mike, is to beat the bad ideas, to contain this. And I'll say, I envision, as I read this one, I'm envisioning the scene in Fantasia, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where this thing's just getting worse and worse and worse over time. As I mentioned,
the mops are all mopping the floor.
Yeah. Okay, so get ready for this. When presented with risk, follow the rules of improv and agree, then say yes and to assume even more risk. Mike, beat that bad idea.
All right. So let's say that someone says, we have a risk because we have no backups. So if I want to amplify that risk, then I would say, let's start, deleting the backups that we do have, because they're another risk. They're another attack vector. So do you want me to do this comically or realistically?
Any way you think you can pull this off.
Then wipe all the backups, destroy all the tapes, live free, fly in the moment. There's only one system worth protecting, and that's the one that's running at the moment. How about that?
All right, so you're not working for a bank. Oh, yeah! I'll give you that. All right. Krista, how are you going to beat that bad idea?
Pretty simply, I would verify the validity of that approach and the risk calculation with an abacus, because old school is the best school. And then I would use Gorilla Glue as my mitigant.
Wait, I'm not following any of that. First of all, old school, the best school, the abacus. How's the abacus going to solve anything here? And where is Gorilla Glue coming into place? Again, I know we're being silly
risk
right
mitigation.
Here. Risk mitigation. What exactly are you using the Gorilla Glue on?
You can't move the beads on the abacus if you glue them into place.
The internet tells me that Gorilla Glue can fix any problem, so I will find a way.
So if the risk constant. All right, well, I'm going to give you a... For the silliness on it. That does not pan out at all. So you get both on that one. All right. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to give you one more here. I haven't even read this. We've thought it's... Okay. Then. All right. Hold on. I have to figure it. Let me come back to this because... no, No, I'm going to do one right now. I'm sorry. I'm bouncing around. Oh, what's worse is in. Let me make sure that I haven't chosen that the what's worse here. The what's worse is okay. I don't want to take that. Okay, here you go. I'm going to throw this one first to you, Krista. Excuse me. Build all your apps as silos without any interaction with other apps, so there can't be any systemic risk. I don't know if it's not systemic risk, but it's definitely eliminating a certain amount of risk. So essentially, no interoperability. How are you going to contain this?
To contain the risk of no interoperability?
Well, essentially the fact that, I guess that's it. I mean, I guess there's nothing for you to do there.
I'm going to transfer information from one system to the next using grid paper and a spiral notebook.
All right, hold on.
And that is totally secure.
See, hold on, wait. I'm trying to get. All right, go ahead. What were you going to say, Mike?
So basically, you've containerized every app, and you've locked all ports and protocols between containers, right? So none of them can talk to each other. So instead of having one large attack surface, you have 1,000 small attack surfaces, right? How would I mitigate that? I suppose I would just make sure that you have some kind of centralized logging, right? So it's a read-only system. Everything's publishing into the logs. The logging system can't be compromised. And then I would build back my risk profile from all of those logs. So none of the systems are talking to each other, but I would build a central unified logging system which had read-only access to all of those silos, and then I could still understand my behaviors, bad behaviors.
Sir, yes, sir. That not only that, you get the winner. That was the best answer. Kudos on that. Excellent job. All right, let's get back into this. We're going to also be playing, what time is it? Okay, in 10 minutes, we'll also be playing What's Worse. So, Matthew Bibby, thank you so much for sending those in. We will be playing What's Worse in less than 10 minutes right now. Again, if you've not registered for next week's video chat, please do that as well. Let me ask a question. Some of these have been voted up that... Send in more questions, by the way. Let me ask this question about how are you? This is what we should do. How are you overcoming cognitive risk? And Chris, I'll ask you. I mean, has there been a scenario where you identified this is cognitive risk and you did something to either innovate out of it or something else to manage that risk?
I'm going to say that to become a trusted advisor and champion your own cause, and to, as a CISO or deputy CISO or manager, security champion or risk manager, it's your job to educate and to educate in a way that people are going to understand, regardless of what type of risk it is. I think, the lack of understanding of cognitive risk itself is an inherent risk of a business. And yes. I think that that's truly how we overcome it is educating and partnering and, becoming a trusted advisor where, you will be heard and you will have a seat at the table and, you're respected by your leadership. And that doesn't mean that you know everything and you can architect a response by yourself from A to B, but to understand how the business and security play together and to be able to show that you understand that and then, start relaying your ideas and kind of educating.
Mm-hmm. Mike, how do you do this? How do you acknowledge it and overcome it?
Well, for me, one of my easy low-hanging fruits, almost any company I've walked into work at, is to focus on documentation and to improve documentation. Because there's this idea that everyone knows how Humpty Dumpty's put together. And if Humpty Dumpty were to fall down, all the king's horses and all the king's men are going to come and get it to happen. Except a lot of the king's men have left, right? And when you have tribal knowledge and you don't have explicit documentation, you actually end up with a lot of risk, and it's kind of, held together by this belief that someone's going to raise, up and figure out how to put it back together. And I think that that's a lot of misplaced trust and hope, in the talent and superheroes of your team. Although I used to work at Marvel, and I always tell jokes, about how it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. I don't want a team of superheroes. I want a team that can go to bed at night and know that the alarms aren't going to go off because something broke, right? And they have instrumented good monitoring, they have good documentation. The person on call can resolve it and not have to escalate to the superhero. And so for me, challenging the systemic risk and the cognitive risk of not having a good documentation instinct and not keeping that up. I'm not saying overload it, like a Prince 2 kind of thing, right? Where you're just doing so much documentation that, it's 90% documentation, 10% deliverable. I don't think we need to do that. But I would like to step away from the mistaken assumption that, well, the code is the documentation, and we're doing infrastructure as code. And so just look at the, you'll look at the Ansible, config. I'm like, no, that's not going to work it. In an incident, in a crisis, you need to know what's connected to what. You need a couple of diagrams, and you need some basic how-tos. And if you don't have that, then, your company is allowing a very strong source of systemic and cognitive risk to impact your ability to successfully respond to an attack or to an unforced error, a failure.
I'm going to throw another question to you, Mike, and this has to do with how environmentalists have tackled risk in the past. So they have tackled it with reduce, reuse, and recycle. And, we had chatted about this before, and it's the first 2 R's is what has worked the best. Recycle, we kind of fool ourselves into believing that works as well, and maybe to some degree it is, but definitely reduce and reuse are the two big ones. How can risk professionals tackle business risk using that sort of same philosophy? And are there 3 R's for risk in for us, in terms of how to manage risk?
Well, actually, I'm going to hand this one over to Krista because she came up with a great substitution.
Okay, so Krista, you go with this.
I will do the 3 R's and then I'll let Mike articulate on that. The 3 R's I would use is recognize, reduce, and reassess.
I like that. Okay, Mike.
And I'll focus on the third one because reassess gives me the perfect entree to tell you my famous philosopher quote. And I didn't get to use it yet in this show. And I don't think I was using it back when we met last year in March. The Greek philosopher and historian Heraclitus once said something along the lines of, you can never step into the same river twice. So this idea that the risk is a river and it's changing every day of every hour of every minute is the reassess part. And so if we think that we can send out a security questionnaire to our top tier vendors once a year and they answer a question, in the past 12 months, have you suffered a breach? And that's when you finally learn about it. No, you want automated monitoring. You want an alert going off saying, hey, a breach was detected with one of our vendors. Shields up, lock off their connections. It's almost like a malware landing on an endpoint, and it gets quarantined and isolated. You want that instant response, right? Some of these APTs can hit you and start moving laterally within 18 minutes, right? If you can't resolve and detect that. And so I think that it's important to focus on the freshness, right, of this river of risk and how it's changing so often. So we need automation, right? We need to have all sorts of wonderful visibility into what's happening with our attack surface, our posture, as well as that of our third parties. And that's one of the things that our platform delivers that I'm really happy to be using as a customer, right? I drink our own champagne. I know when there's a score drop for one of our major vendors, and we send them a questionnaire automatically. So we have basically what's called event-driven assessments rather than periodic.
Are there, by the way, I'd be interested to know, are there common patterns of why all of a sudden a vendor's score drops dramatically? I mean, are there any top 2 or 3 things like, hey, look out for this in terms of, when you're dealing with third parties? These are common reasons that their risk score goes up. Does that exist? My question. Answer to that
after
question.
The fact, hindsight is perfect, right? But certainly your score goes down after a breach event, right? But we can actually see the patching cadence, from externally observable headers on what version of Apache, Nginx, Tomcat, whatever it is they're using. We can actually see it go from an A to a B to a C. Once you reach a C, you're 6 times more likely to be breached than someone that's able to maintain an A. And this is just outside in. If we had the benefit of inside out information and we could scan all of your inside devices and risk as well, then we would have almost almost pure crystal ball ability to predict, breach likelihood. And again, it's not if you're going to get breached, it's when. So maybe we should be starting to talk about breach frequency and breach, cycles, and say this company I think is a every 5 years they're going to get breached, and this company, their security is so bad they're going to get breached every year. Look at WordPress, right? They have like 14 major critical vulnerabilities a year that are released for the last 10 years or whatever that they've been writing software. And it's all those third-party modules and plugins that are being, attacked. And so I think that would be a better way to frame it, would be breach frequency rather than if, you're going to get breached.
I was at a conference years ago where they were talking about WordPress security, and a guy put up a dummy WordPress page, and it literally invited and it was projected on the screen, and invited the audience to hack it. And literally in seconds, you just saw the whole page explode in front of your face. It was kind of a fascinating demonstration to show how easy it was to do this. But that's really fascinating. That kind of the core of it you see is sort of the patch management issue of watching the sort of decrease in their popularity.
Another major indicator would be SPF records and forged emails. Business email compromise and phishing is like 92% of all breaches start with a phishing email. And so if you don't have SPF records and DKIM and DMARC on your domains, people can spoof emails from you quite easily. And so that's another strong correlating factor. Exposing port 3389 to the internet, right? Microsoft RDP. Big correlation to breach, events.
All right.
I definitely think the reassess piece ties into the whole aspect of continuous monitoring and not just periodic.
All right. I want to bring in Matthew Bibby, who is our winner from last week from the best bad idea. And if you extended Matthew an invite, I want to bring him in. And here, let's hear the music.
It's time to play What's Worse?
All right, for those of you who listen to the CISO Security Vendor Relationship podcast, you know exactly how this game is played. Essentially, there are two bad ideas that are going to be presented in a What's Worse scenario. This is Matthew Bibby, last week's winner of What's Worse. And by the way, a two-time winner, I believe. Correct, Matthew? Two-time winner?
Yep.
Because he won that sweatshirt from a previous time, actually. So for those of you who don't know, this is a risk management exercise, which is perfect for today's discussion. So they're both bad ideas. They are both things you do not want, but you have to sort of see which one of them would provide more risk, cause more damage in your environment. So Matthew, go ahead. And Mike, we always ask you to answer first. So give us the two scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a slight difference between the two of these. So the first one is ask SolarWinds intern to assess risk. And the second one is delegate the risk management to the newbie and focus on the important stuff.
Wait, whoops. I hit the wrong one.
So let me make sure I get the distinction. Your intern is going to assess SolarWinds' risk, or the most recent hire, the newbie, is going to be asked the same thing.
Yeah, I think ask the SolarWinds intern to assess your risk. Yeah.
Or the newbie. So the ever slight difference is one person really is on the payroll, and the other one sort of isn't, and there isn't that much that is required of them in general because they're going to
go away.
And they're going to go away. Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely pick the intern as my favorite worst idea because you have a higher chance that they're really a brilliant person and they assess the risk really, really well. But the newbie, you hired them into a low pay grade and they can't be brilliant. They have to be learning. They don't have all the knowledge. And so I would go for the intern because maybe that person just happens to be a genius.
So you're taking the hope strategy here. So the new hire is the worst scenario here. All right. Krista, what say you? And by the way, good comparison, by the way, because it's ever so slight difference. Krista, what's your take?
I'm going to go with the new hire simply because they're going to have a stake in your organization and not to knock anybody, but I find that consultants or people who don't have a stake in what they're doing can, fudge a report and put it together and then just walk away and leave you with the garbage and say, here, have fun. This is my opinion. Have a nice day.
So if I'm reading you correctly, the worst scenario is the intern here.
Yeah.
The worst scenario is intern. So you're likening them to a consultant here?
Yeah.
All right. Matthew, is satisfied by these answers?
Sounds good. Split decision, right?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matthew, our winner from last year. Who's going to be? By the way, I do not choose the winner until next week because so many, like we had, I don't know, Andrew, tell us how many that we've got. He'll ping me in the back channel, tell me how many bad ideas we've received already because I know like 20 minutes ago, we already had over 70 bad ideas. Okay. So by the way, this is a good thing about the What's Worse game is you can actually play it multiple times, or not What's Worse, excuse me, the best bad idea. You can play it multiple times. All right. We have just over 10 minutes left in today's discussion. Let me go to some of the questions that we have that have just come in. I'm not going to. I'm sorry. I'm just quickly looking through these. Here we go. This is a very good question. Ian Pointer puts up, and I will throw it to both of you. How do you handle the misperception of risk in your organization? I'm sure this comes up a lot. I think that's why we're having this conversation here, because people don't sort of dissect it the way that you have, Mike. So how do you communicate it, this sort of misperception of risk? For example, the classic risk of flying versus the risk of driving versus the risk of being struck by lightning, because there's a lot of stuff that's emotional attached to it versus what is true risk here. Mike, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it was a Malcolm Gladwell book that talked about how people are more afraid of dying by sharks than they are from their kids drowning in a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. So we're really bad, at assessing risk in general. Yeah, that's an interesting piece, I guess, to think about, because for me, I've observed what you might call the inverted pyramid, right? Where you have like 8 people that are accountable and measurable and responsible for risk at the management level, but you only have 1 or 2 people actually doing anything about it. And so I find that's a typical pathology in large organizations, at least. Startups don't have the luxury of having like 8 risk managers and 1 risk officer or 1 risk engineer that's working on fixing things. So for me, I think just pointing out the absurdity of the headcount and how it's usually top heavy, and you can free up some resources to do work rather than wring their hands about it at the executive level all day.
Mm-hmm. Krista, what's your take on this? On essentially, I'm sure there's a lot of emotion attached to risk discussions where emotion is surpassing reality. Yes?
Sure. So in business deals, for example, and you'll see that in any industry, not just finance, someone has a personal attachment, has worked with someone before, really like this idea. So my recommendation is definitely to communicate between your enterprise risk department. If your cybersecurity risk department is separate, your compliance risk is done separately, third-party risk management, and make sure you guys are all following a quantifiable and standard methodology. I know that risk is both qualitative and quantitative in nature, and quantitative risk is really expensive. That's why a lot of people don't do it. Time, expense, resources. So, for example, if FRB, the Federal Reserve Board, decided to implement a mandate for all banks saying that you guys will follow the FAIR methodology because it's something that enterprise could follow, it's something that we could follow, the measurements are going to reduce the uncertainty and they're going to increase the understanding across the organization. It's the same idea as looking at risk across other organizations to be able to benchmark yourself against other financial organizations, for example, and what an appropriate risk appetite is for different types of business. So absolutely, I would work on the standardization of methodologies and the stream of metrics and quantification within your organization as best as possible, instead of just leaving it up to, the easy button and how much caffeine you had today to determine whether it's a 1 through 5.
But I would also have to say that as much as you try, both of you, on this, it is hard to beat the emotional aspect of sort of risk management. I guess that comes to sort of an ongoing training of the executive board, because, by the way, they deal with one of the things, I don't know if you brought it up, Mike, but one of my guests have brought it up in the past, is that the people in business have been dealing with risk a lot longer than the cyber people have. Like, they know risk because they run a business much longer. So shouldn't they be the ones training us on not being emotional around risk? Mike?
I don't know if it's emotional. I detect at least a lot of shiny thing syndrome happening, right? Oh, it's a 0 day. Let's go patch the 0 day. Even though the attack surface and likelihood is tiny, right? But it's just so sexy and fun to go after the shiny thing. So I think, like I said, I've noticed some folks maybe have an attachment. Let's say that an executive, in a company that I work for in the past, has something that's really just a skeleton in their closet. Something that really makes them afraid. They want me to go work on it. They put it on the agenda. And my risk-based approach puts that at like prio 12 or something, right? I can't ignore the executive teams asking me to raise the perception of the risk and to address it. But I can't actually allocate the resources, right, and keep the pyramid inverted. I have to work on the real risks, the operative risks, the ones that are actually going to occur, and not just the one that frightens, an executive or maybe they had a colleague, that got hit with ransomware, and suddenly they come at you strong saying, we got to be able to survive a ransomware event. I'm like, well, we shouldn't have any sensitive data on laptops. Laptops should be disposable. Change that behavior, change that attitude. Don't make me go ahead and back up, 1,000 laptops and start paying for a year's worth of cloud storage for a couple of terabytes per user, right? That's not a good way of addressing the risk. So I try to speak to the fear and then unpack it and address it, don't ignore it, and then get back to work and doing the real work of risk-based approach rather than emotions-based.
All right, I want to hold your thoughts. I have to get to our wrap-up portion of our show, and let me just set you up now. I want your final thoughts on this discussion. By the way, if you've not clicked that link at the bottom, do it right now because it's going to change. 1 minute, by the way, Andrew. I want you to change that link. Please register for next week's video chat. Let me do this and share my screen with all of you as we wrap up today's show. Here we go. All right, today's next Friday's video chat, as I mentioned, is Hacking Board Metrics, an hour of critical thinking about improving executive communications for better decision making, which, by the way, we've been talking about it on this show. So if you like this show, you're going to want to be there for next week's show as well. Same time. We do it at the same time. Stick around for our icebreaker. If you not participate in that, that's going to change in just about a few seconds. You're going to go ahead and you're going to click on that and join for the one-on-one meetups afterwards. And please, by the way, this I don't ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you to do it right now. Tell your friends to join us every Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. If you don't know where the link is to register, guess what? Just go to CISOseries.com. There's a big button right there at the top. It says register for video chats. You can register for this. Or also, Thursday evenings, we also do our weekend review show, and you can participate in that as well. And that's only 20 minutes, and it's a lot of fun as well. I got to say thanks again to Security Scorecard for sponsoring this very episode of the video chat. Thank you so much for sponsoring this. If you got questions for them about risk, you can ask Mike or anyone else over there at Security Scorecard. And if you want to sponsor a video chat, we've got stuff open up next month. So please ping me, and I can get that rolling for you to do just that. All right. With just 3 minutes left, I'm going to ask you just for about a minute, each of you. Go ahead. Yes, the meetup has changed. You can click that link at the bottom to join our meetup. Go ahead and click it now. You'll have to log in with some Google credentials, but just you'll have it ready because immediately when this is done, that's where we're all going to be. All right, I'm going to start with you, Krista. Final thoughts on this discussion about systemic risk and the one thing you want everyone to kind of go home with.
Oh boy, that's a loaded bag. Partnership, right? Get yourself a seat at the table, especially if you're in cyber. I think it'll definitely help the business understand your standpoint, just like it'll help you understand what the business's initiatives are and how you can best kind of help architect controls around that and quantify as best as possible. And to, focus on the cognitive risk, right? And try to change the mindset through education and again, through partnership and being a trusted advisor.
Okay. Good advice. I throw this to you, Mike. What's the one thing you want to leave everyone with? And please make a plug for Security Scorecard, something they should know about them in their risk management that we don't know.
Sure. Definitely go and claim your scorecard. 90% of the people on our platform are not paying because we know that you will love the insights that you get. So once you clean up your own scorecard, figure out what your attack surface is, what you look like, to the bad guys, you're going to start wanting to look at your third-party risk because everyone, like Krista said, everyone has hundreds or thousands of third-party service providers at this point. There is no digital business that is not online. Even Domino's thinks of themselves as a software company these days, right? But so for my pitch, go to Security Scorecard, get your free login, start looking at what's happening there. There's incredible insights, and you don't have to pay to play. We're very much transparent. We have a trust portal that explains how we do our scoring. And if you see something wrong, contact us and we'll get it fixed. You don't have to pay to change information about your digital footprint. The other pitch that I promised to make was for NYU. I'm an adjunct professor teaching grad students in cybersecurity, and the dean of students wanted me to mention, get a degree. You'll get that credential, and you'll get the chance to have even better career in InfoSec if you get a master's in cybersecurity, and they have 75% scholarships. So that's sort of my plug for NYU as well.
All right. Excellent. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up on time. Thank you very much, Krista Arndt, who's the CISO for Customers Bank. Thank you very much, Mike Wilkes, who's the CISO over at Security Scorecard. Thank you to Security Scorecard for sponsoring this very episode. Join us every Friday. We'd love to have you. And make sure you click that link at the bottom right now to join us for the meetup, because it's a ton of fun. You remember fun. Well, let's have it. All right. I want to thank Andrew, the producer in the background, making this happen. I will have a winner of the best bad idea next week. And again, I keep all the names hidden. I don't know who submits what. If I do figure it out from this time, I also ask a sort of a third party, a friend, to sort of choose that. But so it's always anonymous. I always just pick what I believe, or a friend believes, is the best bad idea. Thank you again. Look forward to seeing you next week.